Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the content patch for the 7th of October 2013. My name is TotalBiscuit with today's gaming news and comment. Coming up in the show, Sony VP speaks out against console exclusivity. DualShock 4 will be compatible with PC from day one, and the prototype for the Steam machine has been detailed. All this in the OC Remix track of the day is coming your way right about now. Adam Boyd, the Sony Computer Entertainment America VP of Publisher and Developer Relations, which is quite the mouthful, was speaking at Indiecade this weekend, and in his keynote address stated that nobody gains anything from console exclusivity. He stated that right now exclusives are simply a way for console makers to brag louder, and nobody gains from exclusivity in perpetuity. He went on to say that developers now have the option to deliver on huge numbers of platforms, and they want developers to be successful. While it's not as surprising a statement, I suppose, as you would necessarily expect from someone that works with Sony, considering he's in the publisher and developer relations department. He's got to actually deal with the guys that are making games for his system, and I think the last thing you'd really want that person to do when trying to deal with these publishers is saying, you know what, it's great console exclusivity. You know what you should be doing, putting it all on our system. And you might think, well, why wouldn't he want all of these games on the PlayStation platform? Well, I think he understands the reality of the industry right now, and he is certainly not the only one. In a recent article with OXM, the developers of Saints Row Volition stated that the current state of affairs was unbelievable, and that budgets were ridiculously huge. They claimed that the games industry's obsession with $100 million games and $60 price points was actually causing irreparable harm. They said that there was the potential to be extraordinarily and unpredictably successful, but the risk is that you can also fail utterly. It's an extremely high-stakes game. And they're right, it is. How many times have we mentioned it over the past few weeks, or indeed months, talking about, say, Square Enix's claims that the games that were selling 4 million copies on their roster were actually commercial failures, and the ridiculously high standards and expectations that came from spending just too much bloody money on the video games they were actually developing, and then getting disappointed when they didn't sell as much as Call of Duty. And then you can amplify that by making your game an exclusive to a console. You limit the ability of people to buy your product. They want to play your game, but they don't necessarily have the system to play it on. Now, from a short-term standpoint, you might say, oh, it's absolutely fantastic to try and get exclusives on your platform because it will move the system and it will give you an advantage in the upcoming console war, but I honestly believe at this point that console manufacturers are just a little bit worried about where this industry is actually going. They see development houses struggling left and right, they see budgets ballooning beyond all measure, and yet the amount of people actually buying games outside of the top tier AAA stuff that is selling large amounts of copies, I mean, even Call of Duty is selling less these days, hasn't grown. We're not seeing a big increase in core gaming on consoles right now. Maybe that's due to the fact that we haven't had a new one in so long, so excitement has kind of died off. Maybe mobile is taking a chunk out of that. Maybe social gaming is taking a chunk out of that. All we've really been hearing this year is video game sales down 42% in America in April. Down in June, despite the release of The Last of Us. This is the kind of thing that they have on their minds right now. And while you might think it would make sense for them not to really be so worried about that, it does concern them, because if there are no good AAA games, then you're also not selling consoles, which is ultimately what you need these third-party developers to actually do. It doesn't matter if the game's also coming out on the other console. What's more important is that the console market in general is doing well. If you look at the current generation, the actual console war died out years ago. Everyone's doing pretty well. You've sold about the same number of hardware units in most regions, so they're just trundling along at a reasonable pace, and every now and again there'll be a little shot fired, like, say, timed exclusives for Xbox Live Arcade games or Call of Duty DLC, but beyond that, it's not as insane as it's no doubt going to be once again with the advent of the new consoles. Companies dying off doesn't help any of these guys. What we need are a set of developers that are financially solvent and can also then take risks, because as far as I'm concerned, part of what is driving core gaming down is the lack of risk-taking, is the lack of original property. And you can't really take massive risks at the moment, because if you do, especially with budgets the way that they are, and the game doesn't sell enough, you could be out of a job. And honestly, that doesn't help anybody. None of the console manufacturers want that to happen to developers. All that does is it weakens the sales of their hardware every time one of these devs goes under. I should also point out, this is not Japan. It's not the kind of place where a single AAA will drive hardware sales through the roof. That is what often happens in Japan with the release of very popular and strong franchises over there. Yes, there will be a massive acceleration in the amount of hardware that's shifted that week. You don't see that as much in other countries. You cannot rely on a AAA release pushing forward the amount of consoles that are bought, especially when a new console just came out, because it's very expensive. And you have a fairly slow transition period. Early adoption these days seems to be a bit frowned upon when it comes to gaming, and I don't blame people for that, because plenty of people have got burned that way. The upticks that we have seen in console sales have come around something as massive as a PlayStation 3 price drop in combination with something like The Last of Us, or you'll see a general increase in console sales when Grand Theft Auto 5 comes out. But we're talking about basically the most popular video game ever to drive that. Those games don't come along very often. You can't rely on those developers to be flush with cash in the same way that Rockstar is. So I like this cautious approach, frankly, but we're certainly never going to get away from exclusives, and that simply comes down to the fact that a lot of these console manufacturers also have in-house development teams, and they are going to be making games for that platform, not the other one. This is not a Sega situation where they don't develop hardware anymore, so they will happily develop games for other systems. Exclusivity is not going away anytime soon, although if we look at the next generation, it seems to have declined somewhat, and I'm hoping that it continues to do so. The president of Sony Worldwide Studios has confirmed that the PlayStation 4 will work with basic functions, that being analog sticks and buttons, on day one on release for the PC. As to whether or not this included the wireless functionality, that remains to be seen, but it is of course possible to plug a USB cable into the DualShock and use it as a wired pad. Now, this was in response to a question on Twitter that asked whether or not there would be DualShock 4 drivers. This is an interesting comment because this indicates that there won't be, that it will simply work by default as kind of a generic controller, at least from the outset. It may then be possible, of course, for drivers, official or otherwise, to be released which enhance the functionality. So what he's implying there is that, yeah, it's pretty much just going to work out of the box, but some of the more advanced functionality, perhaps any of the motion stuff, the touchpad, and the actual vibration functions may not be available at launch, or maybe not ever. That's certainly a possibility. Now, I've actually used this thing on a PC. It was surprising how many of the PC games we were actually being shown at PAX were using a PlayStation 4 controller. And it worked pretty damn well, I've got to say. I think it's a slightly nicer controller than the DualShock 3. It's a little bit of an evolution, not too much. Of the two next-gen controllers that I did try, though, I think I preferred the DualShock 4 slightly, and that was mostly due to the way that the actual sticks were designed. Both sticks use a sort of mild concave design, so they have raised edges around the sticks, and then it'll concave in a little bit, and then generally speaking, there's an actual convex inside of that concave, so the inside raises up slightly towards your thumbs. Now, the Xbox One controller happens to have some kind of grip around the actual sticks themselves, which you might think would make it easier to keep your hands on the sticks, and yes, it does, but I actually found that it was rubbing against my thumbs after extended use, and that caused me a bit of discomfort, so I wasn't really too happy about that. Aside from that, the controller works fine on both systems. They're not exactly massive evolutions on their predecessors, so you pretty much get what you would expect there. I'm interested to see a larger variety of official controller support. Right now, most stuff that you use on a PC will be X input, and it will be focused around an Xbox 360 style of controller. And I would like more choices available. There are some games where I'd prefer to use a controller. Not too many, but there are certain genres that work better with it, in my honest opinion. However, even if you do have a set of drivers, that doesn't mean that there will be default support available in a lot of these games. You may have to configure the device, which is fine once again, but when you get into the more complex stuff, like say the use of the touchscreen or perhaps some kind of motion functionality, then things tend to get a little bit murky. It's fairly unlikely that there will be any official support whatsoever for the motion in combination with the light on the front, which is basically an adapted PlayStation Move piece of technology. the augmented reality stuff that we saw in the controller demonstration, you're probably not going to be able to do anything of the sort on a PC, but one would have to ask whether or not you even need it. Probably not. As a basic controller, it could be a pretty damn good option for the most part, but it could be a little bit tricky to break the Xbox 360 controller's dominance on the PC, especially when it comes to dealing with things like button prompts and tutorials, which more often than not will, by default, display Xbox 360 controls. As to just how basic this functionality will actually be and how much fiddling will be required to get it working properly, we will have to wait and see. And finally, the 300 Steam Machine prototypes have been detailed, with a variety of units being shipped out to the 300 beta testers. The highest end units will include NVIDIA Titans, as well as i7-4770 processors, and every box will be equipped with 16GB of DDR3 RAM, as well as a 1TB hybrid SSHD storage device, the kind of hard drive you'll often find in laptops. The power supply is a 450 watt 80 plus gold, which is actually surprisingly low considering these things are going to be equipped with Titans. And then there are a variety of other graphics cards and CPUs available, from the 780, 760, and then 660s, with CPUs varying from the i7-4770 down to some i3 units with an i5 45070 being the kind of baseline middle-of-the-road CPU that they seem to be equipping these things with. What surprised a lot of people, I think, is the size of it. The dimensions of the actual box itself are 12 by 12.4 by 2.9 inches, which is fairly surprising. The actual height of the machine is only 3 inches, which makes me assume, of course, that this is a flatter device meant to go on its side as opposed to stand up. If you want a basis for comparison as to how large these things actually are, they are slightly larger than the Xbox 360 Slim, which is about 10.6 inches high and 10.4 inches long with a 3-inch width. So that's standing up as opposed to the Steam box, which appears to be designed to be laid down flat. So about that, a bit bigger than an Xbox 360 Slim. Not a bad size, of course, for a system like that. You can certainly get plenty of PCs that are about the size of a 360. The Revolt that I mentioned a few episodes ago actually is very much like that. I do find it rather interesting that they decided to put Titans in a few of them, because frankly, Titans are not really designed as consumer cards per se. They're very, very high-end, and they're reasonably specialized. Really, you can get the kind of Titan performance that you want from a 780 at a significantly lower cost. You can get up to around what you can get with a Titan by simply overclocking slightly. But the Titan does have some specialized use with a ridiculous amount of compute power on board. As a result of that, I'm a little bit surprised that some of them have Titans in them, but I guess they were just really looking towards some of the highest of the high end, and they couldn't really put any of the dual GPU graphics cards in that machine. One, because they'd be too bloody big, and two, because they also happen to put a 450 watt power supply in those machines, which is not enough to reliably run that kind of hardware. In fact, I'm actually quite surprised a 450 watt power supply can deal with a Titan and an i7-4770, but I believe it is actually possible. The power requirements of a Titan are not as absurd as you might think. They're fairly efficient, both in terms of energy and heat. Valve have made it clear that these do not necessarily represent the Steam machines that they will be offering around launch, and also very much stated that aside from the custom case, there's basically no difference whatsoever between this and a regular PC. They are fully upgradable, as you might imagine. So essentially, they've made a new case and shoved some hardware in it, for the most part, for the actual test purpose. Then again, they never claimed anything otherwise. Valve is not making a super PC or anything like that, and that's, I think, the concept that people are trying to get their head around. What exactly is Valve doing with Steam machines? What it's doing is providing a footprint, it's providing a set of guidelines, and it's hoping to set standards in order to make the purchase of a PC a little bit easier and hopefully a little bit more affordable, but they haven't mentioned anything whatsoever on the subject of whether or not there will be any price decreases as a result of the Steam machine program, or whether they will actually be subsidizing the box in any way. Only that, of course, they will come with SteamOS installed, which is, again, very easily removed if you want to do that. We will learn more about what their plans are when they decide to tell us, which I would imagine will be sometime in 2037. Alright, that's me done for the day, folks. Thank you very much for watching the content patch. I would like to remind people the reason there wasn't any videos over the last couple of days was because I was at the Escapist Expo. I did mention this about 6 times, but I guess some people managed to miss it regardless. So hey, yep, that's where I was, and you'll be able to watch the panels that I was a part of, hopefully over the next couple of weeks as they're uploaded to the Escapist website, one of which was myself, Jim Sterling, and Yahtzee, so you may wish to watch that. It was good for a giggle, what can I say? Before I go, I would usually give you the OC Remix track of the day, but I'm actually not going to give you that this time. I'm going to give you a track from Nervous Test Pilot. This is the fellow behind the soundtrack to Frozen Synapse, which I believe is still a fantastic soundtrack. I suggested this to him a long time ago. I said, you know what would be great if you did a remix of the UNATCO theme from Deus Ex. You know what he did? A remix of the UNATCO theme. So here it is in full. It is a fantastic interpretation of the classic track from the game. You could download it in the description below this video for free, and I'll see you next time.
Existing isolation, pure, disconnected, alone. We are ridiculous. We are because the barriers between us have fallen, and we have become our own shadows. We can be more if we try.